was going back through some election data from 2016, and it was taking a look. This is projects.538.com/2006-swing, the election with hyphens in between each word. And it's asking what would it take to turn red states blue or blue states red. Now, of course, 538 didn't do a great job predicting the election because they thought Hillary was going to win. But the data is interesting because on this page there's a breakdown of each demographic group. The first one is non-college educated white people. And if you look at Washington, D.C., you look at the vertical axis, the share of the electorate. Washington, D.C. has a very small percentage of, what we would call redneck whites or working class whites. It's like down toward the 1%. It's less than 10%, certainly. Less than 5%. And looks like less than 15% of these people are Trump voters. So again, the much vaunted white working class, the white people without a college degree. In Washington, D.C., they're not Trump voters. Let's look at Hawaii. Hawaii is a state where white working class people are less than 20%. And they vote for Trump, according to this projection, less than 40% of the time. Now, there's some other outliers here, places like Massachusetts, Vermont. Maine is the biggest outlier in the sense that Maine has over 70% of the electorate being white men without, or just white people in general without, it doesn't break it down by gender, so that's another thing to look at, but white people without a college degree. Maine, almost 70% of the electorate is made up of whites without a college degree. Less than 50% of them are Trump voters. So if you look at this, there's kind of an axis running from Washington, D.C. through Hawaii, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Vermont, and Maine that shows that as you increase the percentage of the electorate that is white working class, that demographic group itself becomes more of a Trump voting phenomenon. Now, if we take in all the rest of the states, there seems to be a positive correlation. As white working class people become more prevalent in a state, as they become more of a high percentage of the electorate, this effect, this correlation between the white working class and the Trump vote becomes ever more strong. So you look at Nebraska, I believe this is Nebraska, almost 75% white working class, and almost 75% voting for Trump. Down here, the lowest one in the trend is, I believe, New Mexico, 25% white working class, around 60% voting for Trump. Texas, over about 30% white working class and over 75%. So Texas is kind of, whereas Maine is the left-wing outlier. In Maine, white working class people tend to not be Trump supporters. In Texas, you have a very small percentage of white working class people, but they're overwhelmingly pro-Trump. So, and I think some of the, there's a cultural difference between Texas and Maine. Maine and Vermont and Massachusetts and Rhode Island, these form a group that I call the old colonials. This is the group, they're highly educated, and in this space, there's a huge dominance. There's a huge mythological authoritarianism. Martin Luther King is worshipped. Whereas in Texas, in the South, institutionally, there is this history of racial conflict, and white people are much more implicitly racist, if not explicitly racist. But it's an interesting correlation. The basic contention here is that the more often you are surrounded with it, more often you interact with people like yourselves, the more strong is the groupthink. Which is kind of a logical conclusion, right? If you're alone, let's say you're alone in a room, and you're surrounded, I mean, look at Hawaii, for example, or Washington, D.C., and you're a white working class person, you're alone, right? There's not a lot of other white working class people you can sympathize with, and you have to interact with very different people on a daily basis. Whereas in Texas, there's a lot of confirmation bias, a lot of people around you to support your claims. And let's go on to some others. We have the college-educated white people. And in Washington, D.C., there are about 35% of the electorate. That's the least Trump vote. The greatest Trump vote is, again, Mississippi. And Mississippi is up in the high 80s, maybe 85, perhaps getting up into the 90s for college-educated whites. So if you're looking for college-educated whites who are voting Trump, you're going to want to go to Mississippi. So there's a pretty distinct trend here. If you look at this, it's a trend, it's a slope. The slope is less. But basically, the more college-educated white people are around one another, the more they reinforce their basic interests, their basic views, and they tend to vote more Democrat. And as they become less and less concentrated, look at Massachusetts. Massachusetts has maybe 45% college-educated whites in the state. They tend not to vote for Trump. The Trump vote is something around 40%. If you look at Mississippi, they're well under 25%, hovering around the low 20s, and Trump support is high. So basically, when a group, a demographic, is more numerous, it acts more in the way that you would expect that demographic to act. So now let's look at black people. In Washington, D.C., black people are 50% of the electorate, and they vote for Trump a negligible amount of the time. Now this line is pretty much a straight up and down, infinite slope. And the trend that's appearing here is that whether black people are numerous, as in Washington, D.C., or whether they're not numerous at all, as in Wyoming, they pretty much vote Democrat in a very similar way. The black voting patterns do not change regionally. There's no distinct regional culture between black people. Black people in Wyoming vote the same as black people in Washington, D.C., vote the same as black people in South Carolina, etc., etc. The one outlier here comes from Nebraska, which is interesting. Black people here vote for Trump perhaps 20% of the time, or the high teens, 15%, 20% of the time. And that's a place where there are barely any black people. So again, this is sort of reinforcing what I've already said, that if you have a population group, a demographic group, a cultural group of people, a group with its own mythos of how it came to be and its relationship to everyone else in the world. If you have a group like that and you make it more numerous, it's going to conform to its own mythology more strongly. And as you make it less numerous, it's going to be a little bit more libertarian in its mythology. That's the trend that I'm seeing here. Now, you might expect the opposite without looking at the data. You might expect, well, as a group of people becomes less numerous, it becomes more entrenched in its own mythology. That's not actually the case, according to this data. According to the data, it seems like the more people are surrounded by their own demographic type, the more they reinforce their own mythology. The less they're surrounded by their own demographic type, the less they reinforce their own mythology, insofar as the 2016 vote. Now, if we look at Hispanics and Latinos, if you look at again, it's kind of similar to the black vote in that there's no obvious slope. But it looks more like a flower. It's going off in all directions. So you look at New York, and Latinos are they're down in, again, the low teens, perhaps 10% voting for Trump. If you look over at Ohio, 40% of them are voting for Trump. If you look at Florida, 35% of them are voting for Trump. If you look at New Mexico, it's going down further. New Mexico's, and this is a very interesting, it's sort of a parabola on the graph here. And so down at the far left end of the parabola, you again have Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. has a very small Hispanic percentage, and it has a very small Trump vote, down in the teens. Then you go up past New York, Nevada, California. California is sort of in the middle of the Hispanic range. The lowest Hispanic range is they're 90% for Hillary. The highest Hispanic range would be Ohio. Ohio, they're in the high 40s. And right in the middle is California. In California, Hispanics vote for Hillary maybe 75% of the time. In New Mexico, it's a little bit better. New Mexico, again, has a very high percentage of Hispanics. We're talking about the upper 30s, 35, getting into the 40s. And New Mexico, they're voting for Hillary maybe 70% of the time. So it's really interesting. There are a lot of states where there are very few Hispanics at all. And the average for them, the U.S. average is around 25% for Trump. 25 voting for Trump, 75 for Hillary or Jill Stein or whoever else. So that's an interesting distinction between the black vote, which is pretty uniform, and the Hispanic vote, which is sort of all over the place, which makes sense because New York Hispanics might be Dominicans, they might be, I don't know, Brazilians, whatever they are, whereas in Ohio it might just be Mexicans, or it might just be Cubans. In Florida, there's a lot of Cubans, so the Hispanic vote can be broken down into different demographic groups in the same way that the white vote can be broken down into college-educated, non-college educated. But in terms of the black vote, there's pretty much just one black demographic. There's not a lot of wiggle room in there. Now, I saw an article, I think it was in The Atlantic, and it was showing, I wish I took a picture of it or had a paid subscription or found it online, where he was talking about what would you need to do to make a black voter vote Republican on average. And it was like, well, they would need to live in the Midwest, and they would need to be an evangelical Christian, they would need to have a college degree. College degrees for black men actually cause them to vote Republican more of the time, which is the opposite of white people. The less educated white people are, the more often they vote Republican, but it's the opposite with black people. So again, this is indicating that as you further educate a person, as their intelligence increases, the variability of their opinion increases. As their intelligence decreases, they default to identitarianism, is pretty much the pattern that I see with the black vote. Now let's move on to Asians. Asians, most populous in Hawaii, over 50% of the state electorate in Hawaii. And they're pretty much very similar to Hispanics, about 25% voting for Trump. This is kind of weird because back in the days prior to Clinton, Asians were looking like a possible Republican demographic. No longer. Now we have in Nevada and Arkansas, which have very few Asians at all, they're almost voting high 40s for Trump. Almost a Trump majority there. So again, it seems like if you look, if there is any slope to be had here, it seems that if you look at a place like California, Washington, New Jersey, these are places that have higher percentages, higher concentrations of Asians. So in California, you have high concentrations of Asians, even though they're less than 20% of the overall electorate. They're still concentrated, so they're surrounded by other Asians, and they're voting for Trump maybe 25% of the time. You look at the opposite end, you start getting into Minnesota, Oklahoma, South Dakota, where there are far less Asians, and they're far more spread out. They're starting to edge into the upper 30s, upper 40s, almost going for Trump. The outlier to this trend is Alaska. Alaska has in the high 20s as a percentage of the electorate, and they're almost voting for Trump. So then it breaks it down by each state, and it gives basically each state. The U.S. average is that 41.6% of the U.S. electorate are non-college educated whites, which is a pretty big demographic. 31.3% are college educated whites. If you add that up together, that paints a doubtful picture because that's, well, actually, let me strike that. We're talking about the electorate here. We're not talking about the population, so that's different. 72.9% of the electorate is white. It's different from the people who reside here. Voters, they have to be citizens in most cases. They have to be, they have to have the agency to get to the polls. In some states, they cannot be felons, although that has changed in Florida. We might talk about that today. Then the blacks make up 13%, Hispanic Latinos make up 8.9%, Asians make up 5.3%. And it just goes down the line. You can look at each of the states there. But I mean, isn't 2016 over? Why are we still talking about 538? Why are we looking at Aaron Bykoff and David Wasserman? And why are we reading what they have to say on what's this dude's website? Nate Silver. Why do we care about Nate Silver? Why do we care about these demographics? Well, there's two things. There's something you can do on here. You can move things around. You could say, well, what if non-college educated whites voted for Trump 100% of the time? And you can look at the electoral map and he just blows everyone away. What if college educated whites voted for Trump 100% of the time? Again, blows everybody away, right? So if white people voted in the same way that black people vote 93% Democrat, if white people voted in the same way, the Republican Party would just blow. I mean, the Democratic Party would no longer be a viable party, essentially. So that's an interesting conclusion. You can. What if Hispanics and Latinos became just as Democrat as blacks? What would happen then? What if Asians became just as Democrat as blacks? So not only looking at what if whites became more identitarian and racialist in the same way that blacks are in their mythology, but what if Asians and Latinos did the same thing? And what if whites, we moderate that? I mean, whites still win ultimately in a numbers game because they're a majority of the electorate. But if you put whites back where they start, then you get a different picture forming. If you put them where they start and you don't move them at all, if Asians and Hispanics start voting like blacks, then Democrats win. And this is something that I predict, the South Africa effect, the humiliation effect. Essentially, Hispanics and Asians are moving more and more toward the Democrats every year. There's a reinforcing mythology there. And as a result of that, the white people are growing more cowed and they're moving less away. Actually, Mitt Romney earned less of the white vote than Trump did. So it's not certain to me that white people are moving more and more toward Republicans. That's not certain at all. In fact, you look at some of the main Democrat blocks, the transgender bloc, the LGBTQ bloc. More white people are identifying as LGBTQ. You look at white teens, and it's like something ridiculous, like 25% of white teens identify as some form of LGBTQ. And these people vote for Democrats in high numbers. So, I mean, there's a lot of interesting things. We could bring up morphogenetic fields. The idea that when you're surrounded by people, your influence, your behavior, your psychology, your outlook on life is changed. So the morality, the mythology, the people around you affects you, which is an interesting thing. And then we can look at what's happening. If we look at 2016 and we look at all these demographic groups and we start getting down into the weeds, what's happening in Florida? Florida has gained a bunch of Puerto Rican residents. There was a huge refugee crisis. Puerto Ricans moved, about 200,000 moved to Florida. Now, if you look at the number of votes that Trump won, he won by 50,000 votes. And so what's the point here? Well, if all those Puerto Ricans, they couldn't vote in the presidential election in Puerto Rico, but they are American citizens. Once they move to one of the 50 states, they become voters. If they move to Florida and they all vote, Trump loses Florida. What's the other problem? Felons. Something like 2 million felons in Florida, and they gained the right to vote. So 2 million felons are now voting versus 2016, 200,000 Puerto Ricans. Again, you can say, well, felons aren't going to vote because they're stupid, they have no agency. Fine. They have low voter turnout. Fine. Puerto Ricans have low voter turnout. Fine. But still, you're talking about 1.2 million people who are now in Florida, and what percentage of them need to vote? It's less than 10%. It's less than 5%. Only 5% of these new residents of Florida, the felons and the Puerto Ricans, need to vote in order to swing Florida toward the Democrats. So that is, that is something that's extremely doubtful that Trump can overcome that in Florida. And we're looking at his approval rating. And we can look at his approval rating, and it's not the best. So, we can compare it to other presidents. I suggest that everyone looks into the data. And don't be surprised. Don't be surprised on what happens. And there is a certain level of preparedness. I'm not someone, again, I talked with people about this in terms of, how accelerationists are you going to be? And people put it in terms of blackpilling. And I think that is sometimes a good way to put it, but sometimes it's not a good way to put it. But when people say things like, maybe the Democrats would be better, maybe accelerationism is the right thing to do. As narrow as Donald Trump's victory is, and as unlikely, it's looking like he's going to have an unlikely victory in 2020, depending on who he runs against. Of course, if he runs against Hillary again, he'll probably beat Hillary. If he runs against Tulsi Gabbard, I don't know what's going to happen. How is that going to play out? If he runs against Bernie, if he runs against Biden, what's going to happen? Because, I can give my opinion of all these people, but it doesn't matter. It's what the American electorate thinks of these people, and also the Electoral College. So, you need to be prepared for that, but the question of, what is better or what is worse in an ideal world, what should we do? How should we comport ourselves to this reality? And I think the answer is you have to look at the razor thin edge that people are walking on in terms of censorship. Now, Trump is not actively helping people. Look at so many things, and who has he helped? Well, he's done tax cuts for the rich, and he's moved the Jerusalem embassy. These are his huge policy victories that have not been struck down. So I look at those and I say, who has he helped? Well, he hasn't helped me. I didn't benefit from the embassy. I didn't benefit from the tax cut. And he hasn't helped the majority of the people who elected him. So, he's not actively really helping. But on the other hand, he's not really actively hurting. He's not actively telling the FBI to go harder. He's not unleashing the FBI on people. He's not unleashing, the NSA on people. He's not unleashing Google on people. He's not encouraging. He's not necessarily aiding and abetting the left, the Democrats. He's kind of standing back and doing nothing. Now, whether it's because he can't do anything or whether he doesn't want to do anything, I don't know. I don't know what's going on in the White House. I don't know what's going on in his mind. I'd like to assume, it gives me a warm, fuzzy feeling to think he's a really nice guy. He just can't do anything because they're threatening his family or however they're pressuring him or blackmailing him. I like to think he's a nice guy, but maybe he's not such a nice guy. Maybe he's a terrible guy. It doesn't really matter. The fact is he hasn't been able to do many positive things in terms of policy. There are some positive things I think he does in terms of he does ratchet up the left. The left, it does get angry about him. And that creates an impression in a lot of people's minds that the left is unreasonable. And when you realize that the left is unreasonable, you start to explore alternatives. If the left are fascists, and fascists represent, 51% of the electorate in America, then fascism itself, well, if the left, they're left-wing fascist, then what's wrong with right-wing fascism, right? So when the left goes screaming after high school students for wearing a MAGA hat and standing and smirking, that is a Trump effect. That is an effect of Trump, that the left is going rabid over little things, and I think it does wake people up. I think the media does sort of red pill people in this way. So I think that's a good effect of Trump. And so there's a kind of cultural accelerationism which is happening because of him. I think if we had Hillary Clinton, I think the left would actually tone it down. I think they would take notes from her. And she did an interview where she said Angela Merkel is at fault for the rise of the radical right in Germany because she let in all these immigrants. So I think Hillary Clinton would have actually moderated the Democrat Party. And she would have sort of toned it down, but she would have been doing secret things behind the scenes. She would have been sicking the FBI on people. Like, you think there are political prisoners over Charlottesville. How about imagine every single person who's been doxxed who went to Charlottesville is in jail right now. How about that? How about instead of just a dozen people, how about it's hundreds of people are in jail and no one cares and it's not reported on? How about that? I mean, I don't even know if Charlottesville would have happened if Hillary won. And maybe that would have been a good thing. But I think people don't necessarily understand the razor thin edge that people are walking on, where, Trump is just this do-nothing president. But if you had Hillary in charge, who knows how far she could go? Who knows how far the persecution should go? And how far, she would encourage. It wouldn't just be like Trump is complaining, oh, Google's altering the algorithm to hurt me electorally. Well, Hillary would be saying, no, you better alter the algorithm. You better silence voices on the right. You better, make people think favorably toward me. So, I mean, there's a lot of things that could be done in terms of political persecution already under Trump. All the closest allies of Trump are down the tubes, right? You had Manafort, you have Gates, you have Cohen, you have Flynn, and they're going after Don Jr. So all these people are being attacked by the FBI and getting caught in these procedural crimes. They interview people, and then they say, oh, you lied to the FBI because there's a discrepancy between what you said and what actually happened. And that's very easy to get people in these kind of procedural crimes. Oh, you lied to the FBI because you said this, but it was actually about that. And we found out that you were lying, and so now you're going to jail. Or they're catching people in tax fraud, which all these people are doing. Everyone's doing the tax fraud when you're rich. You can afford to hire some fancy, tax technician to make your taxes go away. Unlike the majority of people who have to pay their taxes, or the majority of white people, working white people have to pay their taxes, but the rich people don't. So that's unfortunate. But you look at the number of people who have been destroyed, who are so close to Trump, and Trump's just sat back. He hasn't been able to do anything about it. Either he doesn't care, either he's a sociopath who delights when people who are close to him, who are loyal to him, get destroyed, or alternatively, his hands are tied. He can't do anything. He can't restrain the FBI. He can't attack the FBI. It's just out of his control. The FBI is literally more powerful than the presidency, which is a scary thing to think about. But imagine the case where Hillary Clinton and the FBI, their interests are totally aligned. Instead of Trump versus Google, instead of Trump versus the FBI, it's Hillary with Google, Hillary with the FBI. And imagine that kind of triumvirate that could be formed between the intelligence services, the presidency, and then these tech companies. If they form a triumvirate, imagine the level of persecution and oppression, jailing of people for no reason, just calling them terrorists, sending them to Guantanamo. I mean, I could be in Guantanamo right now. I mean, why not? Why not? No one would report on it. If I was swatted tomorrow and, I was taken and I was blindfolded in a truck and put on a plane and put in Guantanamo, no one would know, no one would care. I mean, people would ask, well, what did he do? And they would say, oh, well, he was a terrorist. Or they would implant, illegal content on my computer and say, oh, well, that's why we had to put him away. Or, he was planning terroristic activities or whatever. And they can hire some intern to put up some false evidence. And they have these kangaroo courts. I think it's the FISA courts with the FISA warrants. They just put it in front of a judge and they say, well, a special terrorist court. And you're going to get some public defender lawyer. And they're going to say, yeah, you're a Russian agent. I mean, that would be Hillary's excuse for everything. She could jail anyone she wanted. She has infinite resources. She's not spending her own money. She's spending taxpayer money to jail taxpayers. And she would just go and say, well, just FBI, your new job is team up with the SPLC and dox everyone you can and find them all and arrest them on charges that they are Russian agents. They're hostile agents to the United States. Of course, we have a precedent for this. In the Second World War, they were jailing people for being seditious, for being pro-German, for being pro-Italian, for being pro-Japanese. They put people in internment camps. America was fighting for democracy. That was the war that we fought for freedom and democracy, and we were putting Japanese in concentration camps. Now, if America wasn't the powerhouse of agriculture, then what if there was a starvation crisis? Who would have starved first? It would have been the Japanese. So you would have had, some kind of typhoid crisis in the concentration camps. You would have had all these thousands of Japanese people dying. And it would have been all done in the name of democracy and saving democracy, promoting democracy, fighting authoritarianism. So it's been done before. It's been done in World War II. It could be done again. And if you don't think this is plausible, if you think, oh, well, Hillary Clinton couldn't do that because we'd have a Republican Congress and a Republican Senate. That's the argument. But say she goes to war with Russia. And you think, oh, well, that's implausible. There's no way that she could go to war with Russia. Sure, we could go to war. If not with Russia, we could go to war with Iran. Hillary Clinton could easily, she's shown she loves war. She loves these conflicts. She loves, destabilizing regions. And so she could just say, well, it's a war. So freedom of speech doesn't really apply here. Habeas corpus doesn't really apply here. I'm acting in the tradition of Lincoln, she could say. So this is pretty much what a Hillary presidency would give. Which is why, and this has happened before. There are all kinds of people. I think Ezra Pound was arrested at some point or driven out of the country. Francis Parker Yockey was accused of being a dissident, essentially, under wartime conditions. And, it's very sad. It's very sad, the future that is coming. If Florida switches to blue, which it very well could be, and that could be out of our hands. Like, there's nothing you can do about that. You're not going to be able to counteract 1 million felons and 200,000 Puerto Ricans. Maybe they think there's a lot of white retirees that are going to move down there in the 4-year span, or the white people in Florida are just going to go crazy for Trump. Again, if Florida goes blue, looks like a very bad situation, and it looks like 2020, you're going to have a Hillary-type person in the Democrat Party who is going to align with this this out-of-control, unrestrained FBI. We haven't seen anything like this with the FBI since J. Edgar Hoover. Maybe it's always been like this, but we just haven't seen it so preeminent. They're attacking all the closest allies of the president. They're just taking out each and every one of them who does not go against Trump. So Bannon said, oh, Trump is stupid, and so Bannon is safe because he's defected from Trump. Chris Christie is safe because he defected from Trump. And, you can blame Trump. You can say, well, Trump offended Bannon or Trump insulted Christie. And so that's the reason why. I'm not blaming these guys. I'm just sort of logically explaining how people are being targeted here. So the closest allies of the president are being targeted. What's going to happen when it's no longer, the FBI is no longer turning the guns on the president, but they're turning the guns on, prominent Trump supporters? What's going to happen to Tucker Carlson? If a Democrat wins in 2020, what's going to happen to him? Who's to say they don't have some Mueller? Robert Mueller is just going to become like the King Inquisitor. And Robert Mueller is still going to be doing the Russian investigation in 2021, and he's going to indict Tucker Carlson. He's going to ask Tucker Carlson a bunch of questions, and he's going to, catch Tucker Carlson in some kind of procedural lie. Oh, well, you said this, but actually that wasn't true. So you lied to the FBI. You obstructed justice, and now you're going to jail. They're going to send Tucker Carlson to jail. I mean, I hope it doesn't happen, but I'm just saying, you have to be prepared for that. And that's why I think when you're facing a situation where now the president, the guy who's in power is under full attack. I mean, they're just gunning him down left and right. And now they've got Roger Stone. I mean, it just won't stop, right? They're gunning him down. They've taken out, Alex Jones, for the most part, who's a Trump supporter. They're destroying his financial enterprise. And so they just keep taking out people. What happens when there's a Democrat? And that Democrat, so the FBI, they're no longer attacking the president. The president is their ally. Then they can attack everyone. Then they come for everyone else. So they're going to come for these people. And I hope people are prepared for this. And you're not going to win this battle against the FBI with survivalism. You're not going to win it with physical violence. You're not going to win the battle. You don't have the firepower. It's just not there. It's just not there. And people who have tried in the past, in the 1980s, you had the Silent Brotherhood, and they stole money from some armored cars, and they got a few $1,000,000, which is pretty impressive. And then they all went down in flames, and they all died. So you think you're going to outclass the order, you think you're going to do a better job than they did. You're not. You're not going to do a better job. You're going to fail. You might think you're going to have some momentary success. You're going to fail. If you're a genius, Ted Kaczynski had a genius-level IQ, and he didn't get anywhere. He did not get anywhere. The only way you can say that he got anywhere is because perhaps his writings influenced the culture. And that's where I'm saying that's the important thing. If Ted Kaczynski, instead of bombing everybody, if he had instead focused just on spreading his ideas, refining his ideas, putting his ideas out there, he probably could have had a better cultural impact than he did, going the path of the lone wolf, the lone warrior. So my argument is that people need to be less of this warrior mindset, controlling the streets. Realize that is, you're attacking the enemy at the strongest point. The enemy is holding up a shield, and you're just bashing on that shield, which is a really stupid idea. You should be looking to flank your enemy. And I would say flank the enemy in their mythology. Their mythology is extremely weak. Their mythology is extremely brittle. It's a joke. It's a straw man. It's ridiculous. This idea that everyone's equal. Of course we're not all equal. The idea that simultaneously we're all equal and exactly the same, and immigrants are exactly the same as United States citizens, and then they'll also argue, oh, actually immigrants are better because they work harder, and actually diversity is our strength. You can't reconcile all of these things. I mean, the basic mythology is all messed up, and the people who they say are saints, like JFK and Martin Luther King, these people are really scummy, dirty, dishonorable people who promoted terrible things. They had terrible ideas, and they were on an individual level. They treated their wives terribly. They treated the people around them terribly. They're not good people. So the mythology of the state is just a joke. We're reaching levels of Catholic indulgences that we haven't seen since the 16th century. So it's time for not some warrior to stand up and to hack and slash his way against the Catholic Church. No, it's time for 95 Theses. It's time for Martin Luther. It's time for Protestant Reformation. Now, the Protestant urge, or the heretical urge against the Catholic Church, has been there for a long time. You had the Arians, followers of Arius, who were non-Trinitarians. They believed that Jesus was not God. You had that heresy, which was eventually stamped out. And you had various heresies for about 500 years, or 1,000 years, depending on how you count that. You had all these heresies that were coming against the Catholic Church, and the Catholic Church won and won and won, and they kept power, and they stamped out the heresies, and then eventually they just couldn't do it anymore. And Martin Luther came along, and everyone was like, you know what, this is it is the time for this idea to come, and they had the printing press, and they got the message out, and it spread like wildfire, and not only once there was a mythological rupture in the consciousness of the literate classes of Europe, only then did the warrior princes hop on board and say, oh, this is a great excuse for us to declare our independence from the Catholic Church. Henry VIII did a similar thing where he said, I really just want to divorce my wife, and so I'm going to sort of conveniently, I think it was the King James Bible or the Wycliffe Bible, I forget which one he commissioned, but he said, well, there are these nonconformists, or people who would eventually make up the Anglican Church, and he said, you know what, I'm going to favor these people. So it wasn't as if Henry VIII was some sort of reformer, he was some sort of theologian, or he was like a deep-thinking Christian. He was just this guy who was like, hey, look, there's this anti-Catholic movement out there. I'm going to sort of go with that because the Catholic Church isn't doing what's expedient for me. So I'm saying once you have a critical mass of mythological rupture, then people who are like, hey, you know what, the system as it is not working out, then they can ally with you, and that's when you make things happen. But that mythological rupture, for it to breach the surface of the water, so to speak, it can be underground for a very long time, hundreds of years, thousands of years perhaps. But that has to exist, and that has to be strong, and that has to be powerful, and I think that's where you put the energy into. Because, look, the firepower just exists. The military is a merchant force, and growing increasingly, it is a force of drones, it's a force of artificial intelligence, it's not a force of warriors on the ground. So real military might is in finance. And finance, again, these financial elites, they're not interested in, Donald Trump. They're not interested in him, except that he might give them tax cuts, or he might move an embassy or something like that. So, there's these things to consider here. I just don't think people understand these class distinctions. I don't understand, because if they did, they would realize that implicitly the quote-unquote dissident right, which I don't like the term, but people keep throwing this term at me. So the dissident right imagines itself implicitly as a warrior movement. It has failed, it always will fail if it conceives of itself as such. But there's been no alternative put forward. And some people are now putting forth a merchant alternative. Oh, we should just make a lot of money. And I'm saying, well, there are structural reasons why that's very difficult. The easiest path, in my opinion, is the priestly path. And you say, well, what do you do with all the stupid people? Well, I mean, that's another question. But elitism means understanding, as Toynbee did, that history is controlled and moved by minority elites, by small groups of people. So I'm not necessarily offering a solution for the majority of people. That's a different video for a different time, I guess. And how does a normal person deal with the problems of the current situation? I don't know. I mean, that's very difficult. There are structural institutional problems that I can't go out and fix people's lives. If people ask me, what should I do to fix my life? I mean, I can give you heuristics on how to live a good life. I would say become involved with a religious community that has good outcomes. The Episcopal Church is not going to be that. So for some people, that might be some I can't even pronounce the word. The SSPX Sedevanticists. It means empty seat, a vacant seat. Sedevacantists? No, that's wrong. Anyway, become involved with something. You think it's the Orthodox Church, you think it's the trad Catholics, you think it's a pagan. You're gonna do the Asatru thing. Okay, fine, but show me the proven results, because there's a difference between the Amish. The Amish have their own closed system. They have their own organic society. So I would say if you're not very intelligent, go join the Amish, or go join some group that has a coherent society that is separate and distinct from the majority culture. if you're just not very intelligent. If you are intelligent, I would say your place is not to just go hide in an Amish community somewhere and do nothing and have no impact on history. Your job is to be, if you are intelligent, to stop strategizing war games and the warrior path and to start focusing on the priestly path. And some people think it's the merchant path, and I'm saying, of course, money matters. So if that's what you're talented at, is making money, and all this priestly stuff just kind of doesn't make sense to you, it seems like a waste of time, then I'm not going to tell people not to play to their strengths. So if you're good at making money, then go make a bunch of money. But if making money is not your thing and you realize the inadequacy of the warrior path in this struggle, then you have to start investigating the priestly realm. And that's an important thing. So before I end the video, I wanted to look at the Democratic Candidate Appeal by Rachel Dottle. We've got some preliminary evaluations of the Democrat. I haven't read any of this, so it's very strange what's going on here. Beto O'Rourke has, there's 5 different things. There's the party loyalists, who I'm thinking are like urbanites, the left, who maybe that's Antifa, black voters. Black voters have their own thing. Hispanic/Asian. Wow, Hispanics and Asians can't even get their separate category. And then you have millennials and friends. I don't know what that means. Apparently, Beto O'Rourke has the most appeal among millennials and friends. I don't know who Sherrod Brown is. I've never seen his face before. Cory Booker is going to get the black voters, apparently. And millennials are just going to overlook his creepy sexual problems. Elizabeth Warren has the left under her control. I guess Antifa loves her. Hispanic Asians love Julian Castro. Joe Biden is loved by the party loyalists. Bernie Sanders is loved by the left. I would have thought it would have been millennials. Kristen Gillibrand has everybody on her side. And Amy Klobuchar has the party loyalists. Again, never heard of her. So they're saying Kamala Harris is on top, followed by Beto O'Rourke, Cory Booker. Now let's look. If Kamala Harris gets in, you know, I don't know about Beto O'Rourke. He's presenting himself as a moderate. Seems like another Bill Clinton to me. But yeah, if Cory Booker gets in, it's going to be Obama 2.0. If Kamala Harris, I'm thinking it's a mix of Obama and Hillary. So, I mean, this is what you're looking at. Do you trust these people not to give you a 6 a.m. SWAT team raid? And you ask why, and they're like, well, you're under investigation for perhaps being a Russian agent. And they destroy your life, and you go into thousands of dollars of debt defending yourself. And maybe at some point you get out of the indefinite detention wherever they send you, Guantanamo. Because this is the point we're reaching. This is what's happening to Trump's closest allies. And what's going to happen is they're gonna turn it on the people who they think are going to threaten their power again, because they've seen Trump. They're like, we don't want a repeat of this Trump thing. So we're going to start, you know, covertly. We're not going to make a big stink out of it, but we're going to start attacking people. The guns of the FBI are going to be turned on the average person. You can say, well, they're not going to take me alive. Well, okay, then, you know, you're going to die in a firefight, and you might take out some FBI agents. But that's not going to change the institutional power in America. You know, if you take out single-handedly 20 FBI agents, you still lose. You still lose. This is interesting. 5 constituencies of the Democratic Party, and they say the Republican has a 5-ring circus, which is the moderate, the establishment, the Christian conservative, the libertarian Tea Party. There's no alt-right in here, which is interesting. I don't know Pataki. They had Christine Kasich being the moderates, the Christian conservatives being Huckabee and Santorum, which I think is accurate. Paul was in the libertarian camp. Trump was in the Tea Party camp, which I think is a pathetic. He was not a Tea Party candidate. Carson, Cruz, Perry, and Walker are supposed to be part of that Tea Party circle. and then they have a bunch of establishment people. I don't know. I think this video has run its course. Thanks for listening, and we'll discuss some more of this next time. Bye-bye.